My name is Dr. Thomas Whitaker, and what I'm about to tell you changed my family's life forever. Back in the summer of 1972, I was a folklore professor at Indiana University, living what you'd call a normal life with my wife Helen and our two kids, Jack and Emma. Helen was always chasing stories for the local newspaper, Jack couldn't get enough of his radio equipment, and little Emma, well, she was special, always drawing things that seemed to come from somewhere else. We thought it would be fun to take our Winnebago, this big, clunky RV that was practically new back then, for a camping trip to Brown County State Park. You know how families do. Pack up some hot dogs, grab the sleeping bags, and head out for a week of nature. But if I had known what was waiting for us in those woods, I might have never turned on to that lonely forest road. I remember it like it was yesterday. The sun was setting as we pulled into the campground, painting the sky this deep orange that made the trees look like black fingers reaching up to grab the clouds. Emma was quiet. Too quiet. She just sat there, clutching her sketchbook, her pencil moving across the paper like it had a mind of its own. When I looked over her shoulder, what I saw made my stomach turn. She had drawn our campsite, but there was something in the trees, something with eyes that shouldn't have been there. Jack was the first to notice something wasn't right. He was setting up his radio equipment. That boy never went anywhere without it. When he called me over. "Dad," he said, his face pale in the fading light, "listen to this." Through the static, I could hear voices, old voices, crying for help. The timestamps on those distress calls? They were from 1962, 1943, 1921. Helen, being the reporter she is, didn't waste any time. She pulled out her notebook and started asking questions at the ranger station. That's when we met Hank McPherson, this old forest ranger with deep Native American roots and eyes that had seen too much. The way he looked at us when we mentioned our campsite number, I'll never forget that look. "You folks might want to consider moving to another spot," he said, his voice low and serious. "That area has history." But we didn't move. We should have, but we didn't. And that was just the beginning of 7 days that would test everything we believed about the world, about family, and about the thin line between reality and nightmare. That first night in the woods was when things started getting strange. After dinner, while Helen was cleaning up and Jack was still fiddling with his radio, I decided to take a walk around our campsite. Emma followed me, clutching her sketchbook like always. The sun had set, and the forest was getting dark fast. "Dad," Emma whispered, tugging at my sleeve, "look at the trees." At first I didn't see what she meant. Then, in the beam of my flashlight, I noticed something carved into the bark. Being a folklore professor, I recognized them right away. They were old Native American warning symbols, the kind that say, "Stay away." I tried not to let Emma see how worried I was. Back at the RV, Helen was waiting with some newspaper clippings she'd found at the ranger station. Her hands were shaking a little as she spread them out on our fold-out table. "Thomas, look at these," she said quietly so the kids wouldn't hear. "People have been disappearing in these woods for over 100 years. Hikers, campers, whole families sometimes. They just vanish." That's when Jack's radio started acting up again. Through the crackling static, we heard something that made us all freeze. It was a child's voice, crying for help. The recording dated 1952. But what really scared us was when we heard our own voices coming through that radio. Conversations we'd had just hours ago. The night got worse when Emma showed us her latest drawing. She'd sketched our campsite again, but this time there was something standing just outside the RV's window. Something tall, with glowing red eyes and a shape that wasn't quite human. "It's coming tonight," Emma said in that matter-of-fact way that always gave me chills. The Beast of Yellowwood. We were about to find out what that meant when we heard heavy footsteps outside. Not normal footsteps. These sounded like they belonged to something much bigger than a person. Helen grabbed Emma and held her close. Jack turned off his radio. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking. Then came the knock on our RV door. 3 slow, heavy knocks that made the whole vehicle shake. "Hello?" called a voice that sounded exactly like mine. "Anyone home?" We all looked at each other because they knew, and I knew, that I was already inside with them. We spent that night huddled together in the RV, not daring to open the door or even look out the windows. By morning, we found huge footprints in the mud around our campsite, each one bigger than my shoe and with 6 toes. That's when Sheriff Cooper showed up, looking annoyed like we were causing trouble. "You folks need to pack up and leave," he said, not even looking at the footprints. "This area isn't safe for camping anymore." But Helen, being the reporter she is, wasn't having any of it. "Sheriff," she said, holding up her camera, "how do you explain these tracks? And what about all those missing persons cases?" The sheriff's face turned dark. "Mrs. Whitaker, some stories are better left alone." Then he drove off, leaving us with more questions than answers. Later that afternoon, Jack was trying to track where those strange radio signals were coming from. "Dad, I think they're all coming from somewhere near that old burial mound," he said, pointing to a small hill about a quarter mile from our camp. "That's when old Hank, the forest ranger, showed up again." He looked worried when he saw Jack's radio equipment pointing toward the mound. "That place," he said, shaking his head, "the Miami tribe called it the Devil's Ground. They sealed something there long ago, something that shouldn't be disturbed." As if on cue, a thick fog started rolling in. But it wasn't normal fog. It moved like it had a purpose, swirling around our RV, even though there wasn't any wind. Through the mist, we could see shapes moving and hear voices calling our names. Emma started drawing frantically in her sketchbook. When she showed us the picture, my heart nearly stopped. She had drawn Jack, but he looked different, almost like he was changing into something else. And in the corner of the drawing, there was a date. Tomorrow. "We need to leave," Helen whispered, holding Emma close. But when we tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. We were stuck there, with night falling again, and something in the fog was getting closer. Jack grabbed his radio, determined to figure out where the signals were coming from. "I'll just go a little way toward the mound," he said. "I can track it better from there." "No!" Emma screamed suddenly. "Jack, don't go. That's what it wants." But it was too late. Before I could stop him, Jack had already slipped out the door and into the fog. That was the last time we saw him. At least the last time we saw him as himself. We spent the next few hours calling for Jack, our voices getting hoarse. The fog was so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. Helen was trying to stay strong, but I could see she was terrified. Emma just sat there, drawing picture after picture, each one darker than the last. That's when we heard Jack's voice through his radio that he'd left behind. "Dad, Mom, help me. I'm in some kind of cave, under the burial mound, but I'm not alone down here." His voice cut off with a burst of static. Then something else came through the radio, a deep growling sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. We had no choice. We had to go find him. Hank showed up just as we were getting ready to leave the RV. He brought his old hunting rifle and some strange-looking pouches filled with herbs. "The Piasa," he said quietly, hanging one of the pouches around Emma's neck. "That's what my people called it. A river demon that feeds on families. Been here longer than the trees themselves." As we walked toward the burial mound, Emma kept tugging at my sleeve. "Sheriff Cooper knows," she whispered. "He's been feeding it. That's why people keep disappearing." We found the cave entrance hidden behind some bushes. Helen's camera flash showed old carvings on the walls, the same symbols I'd seen on the trees. But what really scared us were the fresh scratches, like something huge had been dragging things inside. The deeper we went, the colder it got. Our flashlight beams showed scattered belongings, old camping gear, backpacks, things left behind by people who never made it out. Then we heard Jack's voice again, closer this time, but different somehow. "Mom! Dad! Is that you?" "Jack," Helen called out, "keep talking, honey, we're coming." But Hank grabbed her arm. "That ain't your boy calling," he said grimly. "Not anymore." Then we saw them. Two glowing red eyes in the darkness ahead, and they were getting closer. And behind us, we heard footsteps. Sheriff Cooper's footsteps, blocking our way out. Emma grabbed my hand tight and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "It's starting." In that dark cave, everything happened fast. Sheriff Cooper appeared behind us with a gun, but his eyes looked wrong. Empty, like someone had turned off the lights inside. "You should have left when I told you to," he said. "Now it's too late. The beast needs to feed, and your family bonds are strong, just the way it likes them." Suddenly, Jack stumbled out of the darkness. But it wasn't really Jack anymore. At least, not completely. His skin looked strange, and his eyes had a faint red glow. He was fighting something inside him. You could see it in the way he moved. "Dad," he choked out. "It's trying to change me, like it changed the others." Helen raised her camera and took a picture. The flash lit up the cave for a split second, and we saw it. The beast of Yellowwood. It was huge, like a wolf standing on two legs, but wrong in ways I can't explain. The flash made it howl and step back, shielding its eyes. That's when Hank sprang into action. He started chanting in his native language, throwing some kind of powder from his pouches. The beast snarled but couldn't come closer. Emma, my brave little girl, opened her sketchbook and held up her latest drawing. It showed the beast backing away from bright light. "The Flash!" she shouted. "Mom, keep taking pictures." Helen didn't hesitate. She started snapping photos one after another, each flash making the creature retreat. But Sheriff Cooper tried to stop her. That's when we realized he wasn't just helping the beast. He was part of it somehow. "Hank," I yelled. "What do we do?" The old ranger looked at me with sad eyes. "There's only one way to seal it back," he said. "Someone has to stay. Someone has to be the guardian." Before we could stop him, Hank threw his last pouch of herbs into the air and ran straight at the beast, still chanting. There was a bright flash, brighter than any camera, and a roar that shook the whole cave. When we could see again, both Hank and the beast were gone. Sheriff Cooper lay unconscious on the ground, and Jack. Jack fell to his knees, looking more like himself again, but not completely the same. We managed to get out of that cave, all of us supporting Jack as he struggled to walk. The fog had lifted, and the forest seemed quieter now, like it was holding its breath. When we got back to our RV, the engine started right up, as if it had never been broken. Sheriff Cooper disappeared after that night. Some say he ran away. Others say the beast took him deep into the caves. All the evidence Helen had gathered, the photos, the newspaper clippings, even the footprints, vanished from our RV that night. But we knew what we'd seen. Some things you can't forget, no matter how hard you try. We moved to Bloomington after that. Jack, well, he's different now. On most days, he's just my teenage son who loves his radio equipment. But when the moon is full, his eyes get that faint red glow, and he has to fight harder to stay himself. Emma helps him through those times. Her drawings don't show scary things anymore, but they still come true in small ways. Helen never stopped investigating, but she's more careful now. She writes her stories in code, warning people about the dangerous parts of the forest without actually saying why. And me? I started a secret research group at the university, collecting stories about the beast and other things that shouldn't exist, but do. Sometimes, on quiet nights, we can still hear strange signals on Jack's radio, voices from the past, calling for help. And every now and then, Emma draws pictures of old Hank. In them, he's always standing at the edge of the forest, keeping watch, making sure the beast stays trapped in its underground prison. But the strangest thing, the Whitaker family name means something different in Brown County now. Locals look at us funny when we visit, like they know we're marked somehow. Some even leave little gifts on our doorstep, protection charms and old Native American trinkets. Last week, Emma drew something new. Another family heading to camp in those same woods. She looked at me with those knowing eyes of hers and said, "Dad, we have to warn them." And that's why I'm telling you this story now, because sometimes the best way to protect people is to tell them the truth, even if it sounds impossible. So, if you're ever camping in Brown County State Park and you hear something calling your name in a voice that sounds just like someone you love, don't answer. Just pack up and leave, because the Beast of Yellowwood is still there, waiting. And even though Hank's sacrifice keeps it trapped, it's always hunting, always hungry, always looking for another family just like mine. My name is Michael Davidson, and I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me when I was 15, during a hunting trip that changed my life forever. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about those 5 days in the Allagash wilderness. It was September 1979, and I wasn't exactly thrilled about going on this trip. You see, my dad Paul had this idea that a hunting trip with his brother Frank would fix our family problems. I was that typical angry teenager back then, getting into fights at school and giving my parents endless headaches. Uncle Frank picked us up in his old Winnebago that smelled like coffee and pine needles. He was different from my dad, tough, outdoorsy, and knew everything about the wilderness from his years as a park ranger. Dad, on the other hand, spent his days crunching numbers in an office in Boston. They hadn't seen each other in years, and you could feel the awkwardness in the air. The drive into the Allagash was beautiful at first. Tall pine trees everywhere, like nature's skyscrapers, but something felt off. Uncle Frank noticed it first. He kept stopping the RV, stepping out and just listening. "Something's not right," he said, frowning. "Where are all the birds?" He was right. The forest was too quiet. No chirping, no rustling, nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Things got weirder when we set up camp. While gathering firewood, I found these strange symbols carved into the trees. They looked old, like really old, but somehow the cuts seemed fresh. When I showed Uncle Frank, his face went pale. He didn't say anything, but I saw him quietly take out his rifle and check it was loaded. That night, none of us could sleep. The forest came alive with sounds I can't even describe. It was like something huge was moving through the trees, but not in any way a normal animal would. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Our 2 hunting dogs, Max and Duke, usually the bravest dogs you'd ever meet, huddled in the corner of the RV, whimpering. Even Dad, who usually dismissed everything as having a logical explanation, looked scared. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, listening to those sounds, and feeling like something out there was watching us. Watching and waiting. None of us knew it then, but this was just the beginning of our nightmare in the Allagash wilderness. The next morning, Dad tried to act like everything was normal. He made jokes about the weird noises, probably being just some moose. But Uncle Frank wasn't laughing. He barely touched his breakfast and kept looking at the trees like he was trying to solve a puzzle. We went hunting that morning, but something felt wrong. The forest felt colder than it should be for September. I could see my breath, which didn't make any sense. Uncle Frank taught me how to track animals, but we couldn't find any, not even rabbit tracks. It was like every animal had just disappeared. Then we found the moose. I wish we hadn't. It was around noon when we came across it. The moose was huge, but that's not what made us stop and stare. It was the way it was laid out, like someone had carefully arranged its parts in a circle. Dad threw up when he saw it. Uncle Frank just stood there, his face white as paper, muttering something about how no regular animal could have done this. "We need to leave," Uncle Frank said. But when we turned around to head back, Max and Duke suddenly started growling at something in the trees. Before we could grab them, they bolted into the forest, barking like crazy. We called and called, but they never came back. On our way back to the RV, we found these weird stone markers. They looked ancient, with strange writing on them. Uncle Frank said they were Algonquian warnings from the Native Americans who used to live here. He wouldn't tell us what they meant, but I saw his hands shaking as he read them. That night was even colder than before. The temperature kept dropping, and our thermometer showed numbers that were impossible for September. Frost started forming on the RV's windows, and no matter how high we turned up the heater, we couldn't get warm. Dad tried to use the radio to call for help, but all we got was static and these weird, whisper-like sounds that made the hair on my neck stand up. We huddled in the RV, listening to the wind howling outside. Except, it didn't sound like wind at all. It sounded like voices. Uncle Frank kept his rifle close and told us stories about his ranger days to keep our minds off the scary stuff. But I could tell he was worried, really worried. He kept looking out the windows into the darkness, and I noticed he had drawn some of those same symbols we saw on the trees onto the RV's door with chalk. None of us knew that the real horror was still to come. What we'd seen so far was just the beginning, like the calm before the worst storm you could imagine. It was around midnight when everything changed. I was almost asleep when Uncle Frank suddenly sat up straight like a soldier on alert. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. At first I didn't hear anything. Then it came, the sound of something heavy walking in the snow. Wait, snow? In September? But when I looked out the window, everything was covered in white, and it was still falling. That's when we saw it. In the darkness, between the trees, stood something that shouldn't exist. At first I thought it was a deer, but wrong, all wrong. It was huge, taller than our RV, and so skinny you could see every bone. Its antlers were twisted and huge, scraping against the tree branches. But the worst part was its eyes. They glowed blue, like ice in moonlight. Dad started saying, "This isn't real, this isn't real," over and over. Uncle Frank just grabbed his rifle and pushed us away from the windows. Then the fog came. Not normal fog. This was different. It rolled in fast, and wherever it touched, frost appeared. The windows of our RV started freezing from the inside. "We need to split up," Dad suddenly said, which made no sense at all. Before we could stop him, he opened the door and walked out into the fog. Uncle Frank tried to grab him, but he was too late. "Paul!" Uncle Frank shouted, but Dad was already gone. We waited for hours, scared out of our minds. The thing in the woods kept moving around our RV, making these awful sounds, like a mix between a deer's call and someone crying. Sometimes it sounded like it was right next to us, other times far away. Dad finally came back as the sun was rising. He was covered in frost, his lips blue from cold. But the weirdest part, he said he'd only been gone for 5 minutes. When we told him it had been hours, he wouldn't believe us. He didn't seem right after that. His eyes looked different, kind of glassy and distant, and he kept staring out the windows like he was looking for something, or like something was calling him. Uncle Frank pulled me aside while Dad was sleeping. "Listen to me carefully, Michael," he said. "If things get worse, if your dad starts acting strange, you run. You run as fast as you can." I didn't understand then what he meant, but I would soon enough. The next morning, Dad was different, really different. He wouldn't eat, saying he wasn't hungry, even though we hadn't eaten since yesterday. His skin felt ice cold, and he kept scratching his arms like they were itchy. When we tried to heat up some canned soup for lunch, we found all our food frozen solid. Not just cold, frozen like rocks. Even the cans were covered in thick ice. Uncle Frank tried to hide his worry, but I could see it in his face. Then the voices started. "Michael, come here." I heard Mom calling from outside. But that was impossible. Mom was back home in Boston. Uncle Frank grabbed my arm before I could move. "That's not your mother," he said firmly. "Don't listen to it." The voice kept calling, sometimes sounding like Mom, sometimes like my best friend from school. It was like whatever was out there could copy any voice it heard. While Uncle Frank was checking our supplies, I found something stuffed under the RV's seat. Old newspaper clippings. They were yellowed and crumbling, but I could read the headlines. 3 hunters missing in Allagash. Search called off for missing family. Mysterious disappearances continue in northern Maine. The stories went back decades. All of them talked about people vanishing in these woods, always during the coldest nights. Some were found later, frozen solid even in summer. Others were never found at all. Dad spent the whole day staring out the window, muttering to himself. Sometimes he would laugh quietly, but it didn't sound like his normal laugh. It sounded hungry. "I can hear it," Dad kept saying. "It's so beautiful. The cold. It's so beautiful." I caught Uncle Frank drawing more symbols on the RV's walls, and now he was putting salt lines across the doorway. When I asked him what they were for, he just said, "Protection. From what's coming." The temperature kept dropping. Our breath came out in thick clouds inside the RV, and frost patterns covered every window. But Dad didn't seem to feel the cold anymore. He just smiled, like he knew something we didn't. As night fell, I heard Dad whisper something that made my blood run cold. "They're calling us, all of us. Soon we'll be part of it, too." Uncle Frank loaded his rifle and handed me a flare gun. "Whatever happens next," he said, "remember, that thing out there isn't your father anymore." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. That night, everything fell apart. I woke up to Uncle Frank shaking me. "Your dad's gone," he whispered. The RV door was wide open, letting in the freezing air, and Dad's coat was still hanging where he'd left it. We had to find him. The temperature outside was deadly cold. No one could survive long without warm clothes. Uncle Frank grabbed his rifle, handed me a flashlight, and we stepped out into the darkness. The moon was full, making the snow glow blue-white. Our footsteps crunched loudly in the silence. That's when we heard it. Dad's laugh, but it sounded wrong, like broken glass scraping on ice. "Frank," Dad's voice called from somewhere in the trees. "Remember when we were kids? Come play with me, brother." Uncle Frank grabbed my arm. "That's not your father talking," he said. "The Wendigo has him now." We found Dad standing in a clearing, but he didn't look like Dad anymore. He was taller, much taller, and so thin. His skin was stretched tight over his bones and his eyes. His eyes were that same icy blue as the creature's. "Michael," he said, smiling with teeth that looked too sharp. "Son, come here. Let me show you how beautiful the cold can be." He moved toward us, but not like a person moves. It was jerky and wrong, like a puppet on strings. Uncle Frank raised his rifle. "Paul, if you're still in there, I'm sorry," Uncle Frank said, his voice shaking. Then he fired. The shot hit Dad in the shoulder, but he didn't bleed. Instead, ice crystals sprayed out from the wound. He didn't even seem to feel it. We ran back to the RV, but the cold was so intense it hurt to breathe. Ice formed on my eyelashes and my fingers went numb. When we finally reached the RV, the metal door was frozen shut. While Uncle Frank tried to break the ice on the door, Dad, or what used to be Dad, caught up with us. He moved like a blur, knocking Uncle Frank down. I heard bones crack. "Run, Michael!" Uncle Frank shouted. "The ranger station, 5 miles north. Follow the markers." I didn't want to leave him, but I knew I had no choice. As I ran into the dark woods, I heard Uncle Frank start chanting something in a language I didn't understand. There was a flash of blue light behind me, and a scream that didn't sound human at all. I ran and ran, knowing that whatever my dad had become was right behind me. I ran until my lungs burned from the cold air. Behind me, I could hear that thing that used to be my dad, getting closer and closer. Its footsteps sounded like breaking ice. Then I heard Uncle Frank's voice boom through the forest. "Paul, it's me you want." I stopped and looked back. Through the trees, I saw Uncle Frank standing in a circle of those strange symbols he'd drawn in the snow. He was holding something that glowed, an old leather pouch I'd seen him carry but never open. "Michael, keep running," he shouted. "Don't look back." What happened next is still hard to describe. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling snow everywhere. I saw Uncle Frank throw something from the pouch into the air, and he started speaking those strange words again. Louder this time, like a prayer or a spell. Dad, or the Wendigo, let out a horrible scream. Not like a human scream, not even like an animal. It was like the sound of a glacier breaking apart. There was a flash of blue-white light so bright it lit up the whole forest. The cold became intense, worse than anything I'd felt before. I heard Uncle Frank yell one last time, then silence. When I finally made it to the ranger station, my fingers and toes were black with frostbite. The rangers found Uncle Frank's body the next day, frozen solid but with a peaceful look on his face. Dad was never found. They said later that it had been the coldest September night ever recorded in Maine's history. The newspapers called it a freak weather event. They blamed our story on hypothermia and shock. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel what I felt. Sometimes on cold nights I still hear those sounds, like something walking in the snow, calling with voices I know. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I swear my eyes have a hint of that icy blue. The Wendigo marked me that night. Uncle Frank knew it. That's why he sacrificed himself. He didn't just save my life, he bought me time. But deep down, I know it's not over, because every winter the cold calls to me a little stronger. And sometimes I want to answer. My name is Robert Martinez, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. Even now, my hands shake as I type these words. What happened to my family in Devil's Canyon still haunts us, but people need to know the truth. It was supposed to be a simple summer vacation. As a geology professor, I'd always wanted to explore the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. My wife, Diana, a talented photographer, was excited about capturing the desert landscapes. Our 12-year-old twins, Kevin and Lisa, were just happy to miss a few days of summer school. We'd bought a new RV for this trip. Nothing fancy, just a comfortable home on wheels painted in boring beige. The kids named it the Desert Turtle, because it was slow and looked like one. Diana had filled it with snacks, games, and her expensive camera equipment. We even brought along Max, our golden retriever, who loved sticking his head out the window as we drove. The trouble started on our third day. We were driving down a dusty road miles from anywhere when our Desert Turtle made a horrible grinding noise and just died. Black smoke started coming from the engine. The GPS wasn't working and our phones showed no signal. Just our luck. That's when we met Joe Blackhawk. He appeared out of nowhere, walking up to our RV like he'd been expecting us. He was tall and weathered, probably in his mid-60s with long gray hair tied back in a ponytail. He wore a faded denim jacket despite the heat, and his eyes. There was something ancient in those eyes. "Folks like you shouldn't be out here," he said, but offered to help anyway. While he looked at our engine, I noticed something strange. Weird drawings on the canyon walls that I hadn't seen before. They looked fresh, but that couldn't be right. And the tracks near our campsite, they were like nothing I'd ever seen in my years of outdoor research. Lisa tugged at my sleeve, whispering, "Dad, Max is acting weird." Our usually friendly dog was growling at shadows, his fur standing on end. Kevin stood nearby, unusually quiet, staring at the canyon walls. Joe kept glancing at the setting sun, working faster as darkness approached. "We need to get you folks moving before night falls," he said. "There are things in this canyon. Things from the old stories." That was the beginning. If only we'd listened to his warning and found a way out right then. But we didn't know. We couldn't have known what was waiting for us in Devil's Canyon. The sun was setting now, painting the canyon walls blood red. A cold wind picked up, carrying what sounded like whispers. And somewhere in the growing darkness, something was watching us. Something that wore many faces. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. As night fell, things got stranger. Diana was trying to get some rest in the RV while the twins played cards at the small table. I was outside with Joe, who was still working on our engine. That's when we first heard it, a weird chanting coming through our RV's radio even though it wasn't turned on. "Dad," Kevin called out, his voice shaking. "The radio's doing something weird." I rushed inside to find both kids huddled together, staring at the radio. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Deep voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. When I tried to turn it off, it kept playing. "Those are old words," Joe said from behind me, making me jump. "Words that shouldn't be spoken here." Max started barking like crazy, something he never did. He ran from window to window, growling at the darkness outside. Diana woke up and tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. Then, in a flash, he bolted through the partially open door and disappeared into the night. "Max!" Lisa screamed, running to the door. I caught her just in time. "Stay inside," Joe ordered, his voice firm. "All of you." The temperature started going crazy. One minute we were sweating, the next we could see our breath in the air. Diana grabbed her camera and started taking pictures of the canyon walls through the windows. "Robert," she whispered, "look at this." In her camera screen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The petroglyphs on the walls were moving, changing, like they were telling a story we couldn't understand. "There's a cave over there," Kevin said, pointing through the window. "I don't remember seeing it before." We all looked where he was pointing. Sure enough, there was a dark opening in the canyon wall, perfectly visible in the moonlight. But I'd studied these walls all afternoon. That cave definitely hadn't been there before. Joe's face went pale. He sat down heavily at our little table and took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something about this canyon, and why you need to be very, very careful." The wind outside got stronger, making our RV rock slightly. Through the windows, shadows seemed to move in ways that shadows shouldn't. Diana held the twins close as we all gathered around Joe, waiting to hear what he had to say. I noticed his hands were shaking as he pulled out an old leather pouch from his jacket. "What I'm about to tell you," he said, "is going to sound impossible, but in this canyon, impossible things happen, and right now, something very old and very dangerous knows we're here." The radio static suddenly got louder, and through it, we heard something that made us all freeze. The sound of Max barking, but it wasn't quite right. It sounded wrong, like something trying to copy a dog's bark but not getting it quite right. That's when we realized we weren't alone in Devil's Canyon. Not by a long shot. Joe's hands trembled as he opened the leather pouch, pulling out some strange-smelling herbs and what looked like an old turquoise necklace. His voice was low and serious as he began to speak. "What's stalking us out there is what my people call a skinwalker," he said. "It's not just some old story to scare kids. It's real, and it's one of the most dangerous things you could ever meet." Lisa grabbed Kevin's hand tight. "What's a skinwalker?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a shapeshifter," Joe explained. "It can look like anyone or anything it wants. Animals, people, even people you trust. And that's what makes it so dangerous." Right then, we heard Max barking again, but this time it sounded like it was coming from different directions at once. Diana moved closer to the window with her camera. "Don't," Joe warned. "That's not your dog anymore." A shadow passed by our window. It looked like Max, but something was off about the way it moved. Then we saw another shadow and another. 3 identical shadows of our dog, all moving in ways that made my skin crawl. "It's playing with us," Joe said, "testing us, looking for ways to get inside." "Inside the RV?" Kevin asked. "Inside our heads," Joe corrected. "It likes to confuse people, make them doubt what's real and what isn't." Diana suddenly grabbed my arm. "Robert, look," she gasped, pointing through the window. What we saw made no sense. The canyon walls seemed to be moving, shifting like waves in the ocean. The cave we'd seen earlier had disappeared, but now there were 3 new ones in different spots. "How is it doing that?" I asked Joe. Skinwalkers can make you see things that aren't there, he explained, laying out his herbs in a circle on our little table. Or hide things that are. Right now, it's changing how we see the canyon, making us lose our way. The twins huddled closer together. Dad, Lisa said, I'm scared. Me too, sweetie, I admitted, but we're going to be okay. That's when Diana decided to step outside to get a better photo of the moving canyon walls. Before any of us could stop her, she had opened the door and stepped out. Diana, wait, I called out, but she was already several steps away from the RV, her camera raised. This is incredible, she said, snapping pictures. The whole canyon is... She never finished that sentence. 1 second she was there, and the next, she was gone. Just gone. Like she'd never been there at all. The twins started crying. I rushed to the door, but Joe pulled me back. That's what it wants, he said grimly. It's separating us, picking us off one by one. We have to find her, I shouted. We will, Joe promised, but we have to be smart about it. Because right now, that thing out there, it can look like any of us, and we need to figure out how to tell what's real and what isn't before it's too late. The radio crackled again, and this time we heard Diana's voice calling for help. But it was coming from 3 different directions at once. The Skinwalker was playing its cruel game, and we were caught right in the middle of it. Things got worse quickly. The RV felt like a tiny island in a sea of darkness, and outside, everything kept changing. I couldn't even tell which direction we'd come from anymore. The canyon walls looked different every time I looked at them. How do we find Mom? Kevin asked, wiping tears from his face. Before Joe could answer, we heard Diana's voice again, but this time it was right outside our door. Robert, kids, please let me in. I'm so cold. Lisa jumped up to open the door, but Joe blocked her path. Wait, he said firmly. We need to be sure. Sure of what? I asked. That's my wife out there. Joe pulled out the turquoise necklace. Only one way to know for sure. Real people cast real shadows. Skinwalkers cast 3. I shined my flashlight toward the door's window. What I saw made my heart stop. There were 3 shadows of Diana on the canyon wall, each moving slightly differently. That's not your wife, Joe said quietly. Not yet, anyway. The real Diana is somewhere in those caves. The twins huddled closer together, and that's when I noticed something strange. They seemed to glow slightly in the darkness, like they had a faint blue light around them. Joe, I whispered, look at the kids. Joe's eyes widened. The twins. They have power. Old power. That's why the Skinwalker can't copy them perfectly. He turned to Kevin and Lisa. Have you 2 ever been able to tell what the other is thinking? Feel what the other is feeling? They nodded together. All the time, Lisa said. That's why it took your mother first, Joe explained. It couldn't get to you too directly. Your connection protects you. Suddenly, the temperature dropped so low our breath came out in clouds. The fake Diana outside started crying, but the sound was all wrong, like several voices crying at once. We need to find the real cave, Joe said, pulling more herbs from his pouch. The one the Skinwalker's hiding. That's where Diana will be. But how? I asked. Everything out there keeps changing. Joe handed each of us a small bundle of herbs. The twins will know. Their connection can see through the Skinwalker's illusions. But we have to hurry. The longer Diana stays in its cave, the stronger its hold on her becomes. Kevin and Lisa looked at each other, then held hands. We can feel her, Kevin said suddenly. Mom's scared, but she's alive. She's that way. Lisa pointed to the left. But it keeps trying to make us look somewhere else. Joe nodded grimly. Then that's where we need to go. But remember, don't trust anything you see out there, not even if it looks like one of us. The only way to stay safe is to stay together. We gathered what we needed, flashlights, Joe's herbs, water bottles, and a length of rope to tie ourselves together. As I reached for the door handle, we heard Max barking again, mixed with Diana's voice and what sounded like children laughing. It's trying to confuse us, Joe said. Don't listen to anything you hear. Just follow the twins." I took a deep breath and opened the door. The night air hit us like ice, and the canyon looked like something from a nightmare, twisted and wrong in ways I can't even describe. But we had no choice. Diana was out there somewhere, and we had to find her before the Skinwalker could complete whatever it had planned. We stepped out into the darkness, the twins leading the way, glowing slightly blue in the night. The fake voices followed us, calling our names, trying to make us turn around. But we kept going, following the twins' connection to their mother, heading straight into the heart of the Skinwalker's territory. The air got colder as we walked deeper into the canyon. The rope connecting us felt like our only lifeline. Kevin and Lisa led the way, their strange blue glow getting brighter with each step. Joe walked behind them, and I brought up the rear, constantly looking over my shoulder. "Stop," Lisa suddenly whispered. "Look, there's Mom." We saw Diana standing about 50 feet away, waving at us. At the same time, we saw her standing to our right and then again to our left. 3 identical versions of my wife, all calling out to us. "Remember," Joe warned, "the real Diana is still in the cave. These are tricks." The twins squeezed each other's hands tighter. "This way," Kevin said firmly, pointing toward a dark spot in the canyon wall that seemed to keep shifting, like it was trying to hide from us. As we got closer, the fake Dianas started walking toward us. It was creepy how they moved. Not quite right, like puppets on strings. Then we heard Max barking again, and saw 3 copies of our dog running between the fake Dianas. "Don't look at them," Joe ordered. "Focus on the twins." Suddenly, Lisa stopped walking. "Mom's close," she said. "Really close, but—" "But what, sweetie?" I asked. "She's not alone." Kevin finished his sister's thought. "There's something with her. Something big." The cave entrance finally stayed still long enough for us to see it clearly. It was like a black mouth in the rock, and cold air poured out of it like breath. The fake Dianas and Maxes disappeared, but we could hear them laughing and barking from inside the cave. Joe pulled out more herbs and started crushing them in his hands. "Before we go in," he said, "you need to know something. The Skinwalker will try one last trick. It'll make you choose." "Choose what?" I asked. "Between saving your wife and saving your children," he said grimly. "But remember, the choice itself is the trap. There's always another way." We stepped into the cave, our flashlights making weird shadows on the walls. The twins' blue glow got so bright it lit up the whole tunnel. We could hear Diana's voice getting closer, but it sounded strange, like she was underwater. Then we found her. Diana was floating in the air, her eyes closed, surrounded by a dark mist that moved like it was alive. Below her, the cave floor seemed to drop away into nothing. "Robert," she whispered, her eyes still closed, "help me." That's when we saw it, the Skinwalker in its true form. It rose up behind Diana, a shadow that couldn't settle on one shape. 1 second it looked human, the next like a wolf, then like something I can't even describe. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness. "Choose," it said in a voice that sounded like many voices speaking at once. "Your wife or your children. You can't save both." Joe stepped forward, pulling something else from his pouch, a small mirror wrapped in leather. "Remember what I said," he whispered to me. "The choice is the trap." The twins were glowing brighter than ever now, and somehow I knew what we had to do. The real choice wasn't between saving one or the other. The real choice was whether to trust in our family's connection, all of us together, or give in to the Skinwalker's tricks. What happened next was both terrifying and amazing. Kevin and Lisa stepped forward together, their blue light growing so bright it hurt to look at them. They reached out and grabbed each other's hands, forming a circle. "Mom!" they called out together. "Follow our voice." Diana's eyes flickered open, and for a moment they glowed with the same blue light as the twins. The Skinwalker screeched, a horrible sound that echoed through the cave. "Now!" Joe shouted, holding up the mirror. "The mirror shows its true form. It can't hide anymore." The Skinwalker tried to change shapes faster and faster, but every time it changed, the mirror showed what it really was, something ancient and ugly, trapped by its own reflection. "Diana," I called out, "look at the kids. Focus on their light." Diana started moving, fighting against the dark mist that held her. The skinwalker reached for her with shadowy hands but couldn't touch her through the twins' blue light. Then Joe did something I'll never forget. He stepped between the skinwalker and my family, holding the mirror high. "I've been waiting 50 years for this," he said. "Ever since you took my sister." He started chanting in his native language, and the mirror began to glow with the same blue light as the twins. The skinwalker screamed again, but this time it sounded scared. "Get Diana," Joe yelled at me. "I'll hold it back." I ran forward as Diana broke free from the mist. She fell, but I caught her just in time. The twins ran to us and we all hugged each other tight, their blue light surrounding us like a shield. "You can't have them," Joe said to the skinwalker. "Not them, not anyone else. Never again." He slammed the mirror against the cave wall, shattering it. There was a flash of blue light so bright we had to close our eyes. When we opened them again, the skinwalker was being pulled into the broken pieces of the mirror, shrieking and twisting. "Joe," I shouted, "come on." But he stood his ground, holding the broken mirror. "Get your family out," he said calmly. "I'm finishing what I started 50 years ago." "We can't leave you," Diana cried. "You have to," he said. "The cave's going to collapse. Go." We ran, the twins leading the way with their light. Behind us, we could hear the skinwalker's screams mixing with Joe's chanting. The cave walls started shaking, and rocks began falling. We barely made it out before the cave entrance collapsed. When the dust cleared, there was no sign of the cave ever being there. Joe and the skinwalker were gone. Diana hugged the twins close. "Your light," she said. "You saved me with your light." "Joe knew," Kevin said softly. "He knew we had power," Lisa added. "That's why he found us, to help him trap the skinwalker forever." We made our way back to the RV as the sun started to rise. Everything looked normal now. No moving canyon walls, no mysterious caves. Even Max was there, waiting by the RV door, completely normal and happy to see us. But we all knew things would never be truly normal again. The twins' power didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. And sometimes, on quiet nights, we can still feel Joe's presence watching over us, keeping us safe from other dark things that might be out there. Diana developed her photos from that night. Most were blurry or dark, but one came out clear. A shot of Joe standing brave against the skinwalker, his mirror reflecting blue light, saving our family and finally getting justice for his sister. We left Devil's Canyon that morning and never went back. But we carry its story with us, along with the turquoise necklace Joe left in our RV. A reminder that sometimes the strongest magic isn't about choosing between loved ones, but about keeping them all safe together. My name is Catherine Harrison, and I need to tell you about what happened to us in the Huron National Forest back in 1967. I was 17 then, just a regular teenager who loved taking pictures with my old Kodak camera. My dad, Bill, a retired Marine, had this crazy idea about spending a weekend camping in his new Airstream trailer. I thought it would be boring at first, but I was wrong. So terribly wrong. I convinced my boyfriend Danny and my best friend Rachel to come along. Mark Wilson tagged along too. He was kind of a troublemaker, but Danny insisted we bring him. "The more the merrier," Dad said, not knowing those words would come back to haunt us. It started like any normal camping trip. Dad was proud of his shiny trailer, checking every little thing twice like Marines do. The forest was beautiful in that spooky sort of way. Tall trees that seemed to touch the sky, and shadows that grew longer as the sun started to set. But then the ranger came to our campsite. I'll never forget the worried look on his face as he told us about the livestock mutilations in the area. "Something's been killing farm animals," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. Might want to keep your kids close after dark." We laughed it off. Dad said he'd handled scarier things in the Marines. Danny even joked about it being Bigfoot's cousin. But then he found those tracks near the creek, wolf prints bigger than any normal wolf should leave. And that's when things started feeling different. Looking back now, I wish we'd packed up and left right then. But we didn't know. How could we have known what was waiting for us in those woods? How could we have guessed that this weekend would change our lives forever? I'm telling this story because people need to know the truth about the creatures, about what the government did, about what happened to us in those 3 terrifying days at Huron National Forest, and why, even now, I still can't look at the full moon without shaking. That first night started normally enough. Dad was grilling hamburgers outside the Airstream while Rachel and I sat around the campfire talking about school. Danny and Mark were trying to tune the portable radio, getting nothing but static and bits of unclear voices. The sun had just set when we heard it, a howl that made every hair on my body stand up. It wasn't like any wolf I'd ever heard on nature shows. The sound was deeper, almost human-like, and so loud it echoed through the whole valley. "Must be pretty close," Dad said, trying to sound casual, but I saw him reach for the flashlight. "Everyone inside the trailer, just to be safe." We had just gotten inside when something hit the Airstream. Hard. The whole trailer shook like a giant had kicked it. Rachel grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. "Probably just a bear," Dad said, but his face told a different story. He pulled out his old Marine flashlight and shined it through the windows. The beam caught something moving between the trees, but it was too fast to see clearly. Danny pressed his face against the window. "Look at the trees," he whispered. We all crowded around to look. There, on the nearest pine tree, were claw marks that started at least 8 feet up the trunk. They were deep, too, like something had carved into the wood with metal blades. The radio suddenly crackled to life, making us all jump. Through the static, we could hear the local AM station. "Warning to all campers in the Huron National Forest area. 2 hikers reported missing. Authorities advise, stay in sheltered areas after dark." Mark switched it off. "Maybe we should leave," he said, his voice shaking a little. "This doesn't feel right." But Dad shook his head. "Roads aren't safe at night in these woods. We'll stay put until morning." He checked his watch. "Everyone try to get some sleep. I'll keep watch." I crawled into my sleeping bag, but sleep felt impossible. The howls kept coming, closer now and different, like there was more than one of whatever was out there. Through the trailer's thin walls I could hear them circling us, their heavy footsteps crushing twigs and leaves. The scariest part? They didn't sound like they were walking on 4 legs. The footsteps were more like a person's. If that person weighed hundreds of pounds and was trying not to be heard. None of us slept that night. We just lay there in the dark, listening to those things outside, praying for the sun to come up. Little did we know, this was just the beginning of our nightmare. Morning came, but our relief didn't last long. Dad decided we should pack up and leave, but when Danny went to start his car, it wouldn't work. Something had torn out parts of the engine, not like an animal breaking things, but like someone who knew exactly what to remove to keep us there. That's when we saw them for the first time. I was taking pictures of the damaged car when I heard Rachel scream. Coming out of the trees were these things. They walked on 2 legs like people, but they were huge, maybe 7 feet tall. They looked like wolves, but wrong somehow. Their faces were a mix between wolf and human, with eyes that glowed yellow-green. There were 5 of them, moving in a circle around our campsite. "Everyone back in the trailer," Dad shouted, pushing us toward the door. But before we could all get inside, something strange happened. I heard voices in my head, not like normal thoughts, but like whispers from somewhere else. Looking at the others' faces, I knew they heard them too. "Your father knows," the voices said. "Ask him about Project Moonlight." Dad's face went white. I'd never seen him scared before, not even during thunderstorms that reminded him of the war, but now he looked terrified. Mark had wandered away from us slightly, drawn to something in the woods. "Guys," he called out, his voice shaking, "you need to see this." Against Dad's orders, we looked. Mark was standing near an old tree, holding what looked like a wooden carving. It was a totem pole, small enough to hold, but ancient-looking. It showed wolfmen, similar to the creatures around us, and had weird military symbols carved into it. The largest of the creatures, it must have been the leader, stepped forward. When it moved, the air around it seemed to shimmer, like hot pavement in summer. Suddenly, we all saw the same thing: flashes of a military base, scientists in white coats, cages full of wolves, and people screaming. It felt so real, like we were actually there. "Dad?" I whispered. "What's happening?" But before he could answer, the creatures started moving closer. Their fur seemed to ripple, and their eyes locked onto each of us like they were picking out their prey. Danny grabbed my hand. His skin felt cold and clammy. "Catherine," he said in a strange voice that didn't sound like his own. "They're in my head. They're trying to—" He didn't finish. His eyes started glowing the same yellow-green as the creatures, and when he smiled, his teeth looked sharper than they should be. That's when we knew. These things weren't just trying to hurt us. They wanted to turn us into something else. Something like them. Everything fell apart so fast after that. Rachel said she needed to use the bathroom. The trailer's toilet had stopped working. Dad didn't want her to go alone, so Mark went with her. They were only supposed to go a few yards into the woods, just far enough for privacy. We heard Rachel scream 5 minutes later. Mark yelled, "Run!" and then nothing. Just silence. Danny was getting worse. His eyes kept changing color, and he would switch between himself and something else, something angry and wild. "They're showing me things," he kept saying, holding his head. "Military labs, experiments. Your dad was there, Catherine. They're saying he helped create them." I turned to Dad, who sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "I thought they were all dead," he whispered. "Project Moonlight. It was supposed to be destroyed." While Dad talked, I noticed something on an old tree. A faded metal sign with military markings, half covered with moss. The same symbols we'd seen on the totem Mark found. I raised my camera and took a picture, my hands shaking. "It was 1952, Dad started explaining. They wanted to make better soldiers, ones who could see in the dark, track anything, survive anywhere. They used wolves as a base, but something went wrong. The test subjects. They became something else. Something that could think like humans but hunt like wolves. And worse, they could put their thoughts into other people's minds. The pack—" Danny struggled to speak, fighting whatever was trying to control him. "They're not just random monsters, they're hunting military families. Your family, Mr. Harrison. They want revenge." I watched in horror as Danny's fingers began to stretch, his nails growing longer and darker. He was changing, just like the creatures outside, but he was fighting it, harder than anyone they'd ever tried to change. I could tell by the way they howled in frustration. "Catherine," Danny grabbed my arm, his eyes clearing for a moment. "Take pictures of everything. People need to know the truth, but be careful. They can jump from person to person, sharing one mind across many bodies. That's how they survived all these years." The sun was setting again, and we could hear them getting closer. Rachel was still missing. Mark was probably dead. Danny was losing his fight against them. And somewhere in the darkness, a pack of intelligent, vengeful creatures was closing in. Dad checked his old marine backpack and pulled out a worn journal. "There might be a way to stop them," he said, flipping through the pages. "But the price will be high." Everything came to a head as the moon rose. We found Rachel hiding in an old ranger station, shaking but alive. Mark was with her, or what was left of him. He'd died protecting her from the pack, giving her time to run. I'll never forget Rachel's tears as she told us how brave he'd been. Dad's journal had the answers we needed. Back in the 50s, they'd created a special sound frequency that could hurt the creatures. But to use it, someone would have to get dangerously close to the pack's leader. "I have to do this," Dad said, hugging me tight. I helped create them. I have to help end it. Danny was getting worse by the minute. His hands were changing into claws, but he kept fighting it. "Mr. Harrison," he managed to say, "they're coming. All of them. They want Catherine." The pack surrounded our trailer, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The leader stepped forward, massive and terrifying with scars all over its face. Dad grabbed an old military device from his bag and started walking toward it. "Catherine," he called back, "I love you, sweetheart. Take care of yourself." Then he turned on the device. The sound was awful, like 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard. The creatures howled in pain. The leader lunged at Dad, but he held his ground. They both went down, rolling into the darkness. Danny suddenly screamed. The Alpha was trying to take over his mind completely. But something amazing happened. He looked at me, and I could see him fighting back with everything he had. "I love her," he kept saying, each word a struggle. "You can't have her. I love her." The power of his feelings somehow broke the Alpha's control. The other creatures backed away, confused and angry. We never saw the pack leader again, or my dad, but we heard one final howl in the distance, Dad's last act of bravery. Rachel, Danny, and I made it out alive, but we weren't completely safe. The bite marks on Danny's arm, the scratches on my leg, they left their mark. Now, every full moon we feel the change trying to take hold, but we fight it together, just like we fought them that night. I still have the pictures I took, locked away where nobody can find them. The government denied everything, of course, covered it all up. But we know the truth. Sometimes, on quiet nights, we hear howling in the distance, and we wonder, are there more of them out there? Are they still hunting? All we can do is hold each other close and pray that our love is strong enough to keep the wolf at bay. Because once you've been marked by the dogmen of Huron Forest, you're never truly free.